guys, my name is Miss Zajac and I teach 4th grade at InSkip. I'm really excited that you're joining social studies this summer to dig a little bit deeper into some of these ideas. Today, we are going to talk about major leaders during the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So like I said, this is social studies. We're in 4th grade and we're talking about major leaders of the Civil War. If the video is hard to understand, you can turn on closed captions if they're available to you, adjust the playback speed to slow down the video, consider watching short clips and then pause, listen, and watch again, or ask someone in your home to watch the video with you, stop it frequently, and talk to them about what you heard and understood. We're going to talk about some men that were major leaders in the war, and then your next step after this is to talk about some women who were major leaders in the war. So today we're going to focus on 4 men that were important during the Civil War. The first 2 are leaders of their areas. So Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States, and then we talked about secession, what happens when states start to break apart from the United States. So Jefferson Davis came in and he became the president of the Confederate States of America. So that's why we kind of have 2 presidents at this time. So Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States when the Civil War began. He believed that the states should be together as one nation and not a bunch of independent states. He did not believe that states had the right to secede, and so he was trying to preserve the Union by keeping everybody together, even if he had to be forceful with it. And so what that means is that they had to go to war. So when that happened, Southerners who believed that they had the right to secede or to break apart from the country and start their own governments needed a new leader. So Jefferson Davis became the president of the Confederate States of America, and he tried to negotiate peace with Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln refused to meet because, like we know, he wanted to keep the country together. He didn't even want to negotiate secession. And so Jefferson Davis remained the president of the Confederacy until the end of the war, which lasted 4 years. Then we have major leaders in the war. So these are going to be commanders and generals. Robert E. Lee was in command of the Union forces at the beginning of the war. However, he was from Virginia and he didn't want to fight against his home state. So we'll remember that this war sent a lot of brothers fighting against brothers and against their cousins and their neighbors, their fathers during the war, because people held such strong beliefs about what should be happening and what should not be happening. So instead of fighting against his country, against his state, his home state, Robert E. Lee decided that he was going to become a Confederate general. He led the Army of Northern Virginia. He was a very skilled general, and one of the most successful Confederate armies in the Civil War was under his command. And then we have Ulysses S. Grant. He was the Union general. He led Union armies during the late years of the Civil War. So that's going to be mostly your northern states. Many historians say he was the most capable of all the Union generals, and he was master of the military strategy. So he was in charge of the military for this part of the war. And we know that Ulysses S. Grant later, because he has such great leadership skills and people start to trust him and believe in him, is elected president as well. On the side there, you can see our vocabulary. We have the word strategy, which means that we're planning the best way to gain an advantage or achieve success. And we use it especially when we're talking about war. So a war strategy. And then the Civil War, or any civil war, is a war between citizens of some country. So in this case, we say the Civil War because we've only had one major civil war. So we know what we're talking about when we say the Civil War. And this was between citizens of our same country, between the North and the South. So we're going to watch this brain pop. We're going to talk a little bit about it, and then I'm going to go through your activity for you, which is in the packet. So the text that we just saw is also in the packet. So this is a good review just to kind of hear it instead of just reading it. So let's go ahead and do this part.
Check. Huh? Hey, Dear Tim and Moby, what happened during the Civil War? From Jen. Well, it all started in 1860 and 1861 when 11 southern states seceded. That means they left the United States to make their own country. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. The states that stayed with the U.S. were the Union. Abraham Lincoln was President of the United States at the time, and Jefferson Davis became President of the Confederacy. Lincoln couldn't allow 11 states to leave the Union because he thought it would set a bad example for the future. Anytime a state didn't like the rules, they would just leave. Well, the secession was like the trigger for the Civil War. The long-term cause was the disagreement between northern and southern states over slavery. There were some other factors as well. You can learn more in our Civil War Causes movie. Anyway, the actual fighting between the Union and Confederacy started in April of 1861. Confederate soldiers fired on Fort Sumter, a U.S. Army outpost in South Carolina. South Carolina was a Confederate state, and they wanted Fort Sumter for their own military use. But when South Carolina attacked the fort, they were attacking American soldiers. President Lincoln declared the South in rebellion, and the Civil War began. Every state had to decide which side to join. Border states like Kentucky and Delaware were pro-slavery but anti-secession. In fact, West Virginia was formed from the parts of Virginia that refused to secede with the rest of the state. In the end, 24 states stayed with the Union. The Union was ready to fight. People lined up around the block to join the army. Everyone in the North thought the war would be fast and easy. After all, it was 24 states versus 11. Lincoln himself expected it to last only 90 days. The first major battles of the Civil War actually drew spectators. People would have picnics on the hills overlooking the fighting. The North lost a lot of major battles in the beginning. Robert E. Lee, the commander of all the Confederate armies, was an effective strategist and engineer, and his experience earned him some early victories. One of the biggest early victories for the South was the First Battle of Bull Run, sometimes called the First Battle of Manassas. The Union came up with its answer to Robert E. Lee. Ulysses S. Grant was a talented general for the Union Army who would eventually become its commanding officer. He helped the North turn the tide toward victory, but casualties were extremely high. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 ended with 24,000 casualties on both sides, including around 3,400 dead. In 1863, in the middle of the war, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all slaves held in Confederate-controlled states. Well, slavery was pretty much over in the northern states, but a few of the border states like Maryland still held slaves. In fact, the Union Army had formed units of all African American soldiers by then. Slavery was officially outlawed in all states in 1865 after the Civil War ended. The Battle of Gettysburg in the summer of 1863 was the turning point of the war. Gettysburg ended with a staggering 51,000 casualties, with about 6,700 people dead. President Lincoln visited the battlefield when it was all over and delivered his famous Gettysburg Address. In just a handful of sentences, Lincoln captured the nation's grief and its determination to endure. In November of 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman made a famous march across Confederate Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. In Sherman's march to the sea, the Union troops devastated the state by burning crops, killing livestock, and wrecking the local infrastructure. By 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. It had lost a huge percentage of its young men, and its economy was destroyed. General Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. The war was over. Only 5 days later, on April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated while watching a play in Washington, D.C. His killer was a man named John Wilkes Booth, a Maryland actor who was angry about the South's defeat. So, that's the Civil War. By the time it was over, between 600,000 and 700,000 people were dead, out of a total of about 3 million combatants. It was America's bloodiest war, by a lot. Yeah. By the way, that Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, he went on to become president in 1868. Okay, you can't just take my pieces off the board. Do you even know how to play?
Okay, so there's a lot of information in there, and we're going to pick up with the Civil War when we come back from the summer, when you start 5th grade. So we just want to focus on the leaders today, and I liked that video because it kind of shows you all 4 of the leaders that we're talking about. So then when you go to do your quick review, you can take those 4 leaders and label them. So you put their initials in each statement that describes them. So this is going to be in your packet. So President of the Confederacy, think about who that was, who led the Army of Northern Virginia. You also have the text in your packet as well, so you can go back to look at that, to use that to help you. The last thing that you have to do is an activity, which is a game, which should be super fun. So your goal is to try to match the faces of the leaders to important facts about them. So you're going to cut all these cards out, and you'll notice that you have 2 face cards for each leader. That's because you also have 2 facts about them. So you're not trying to match the faces to the faces, you're trying to match the faces to the facts. So one Abraham Lincoln face will go with one Abraham Lincoln fact, and then another Abraham Lincoln face with the other Abraham Lincoln fact. So first you have to cut them all out, and then you put them upside down and shuffle them up so they're all in different orders. Put them down, and then you're going to start to flip 2 at a time. So if you got an Abraham Lincoln and a Jefferson Davis face, then you flip them back over and leave them. So you have to remember where they are. If you flip over a fact that goes with the person and then you flip over the face and it goes together, then you get to keep the cards. You can play by yourself and just play until you're done, or you can play with a partner and see who gets the most cards at the end. So that's totally up to you. You can keep playing until you've got it 100% and you've totally learned the major leaders of the Civil War. And then you will dive into some other lessons, including in that video you saw, the beginning of the war started at Fort Sumter. So your next lesson is going to pick up there for you. So you can kind of start to get into the Civil War before you go back to school. So hopefully that is fun and you enjoy it. And like I said, you also get to talk about some of the women in the war. So there's some great stuff coming up. So enjoy that. And it was great learning with you today. I hope you enjoyed it. And have a great summer. We will see you in a few weeks.